SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste, hello everyone. Welcome again to my NPTEL course on interior design. We are at lecture number 15, which is a summary and discourse lecture. And we are going to focus on the summary of week 3, where we talked about different kinds of spaces from, retail to transient with examples. We also try to understand concepts of place and space. Then we had a discussion on finishes, interior finishing materials, installation techniques, and we also had a discourse on space making elements, space making crafts, space surface crafts, and what is their role in interior design. So this is the summary for all that discussion we had. So starting to understand the spaces now with different examples that we have seen, we have broadly shaped our comprehensive and rigorous understanding for the domain of interior design. And I'm just summarizing the broad categories that we saw. So we talked about retail spaces, and we also talked about the principles of retail store design, where we had an interesting discussion on VM, which is visual merchandising, then the layout of the store and how itself that is very, very crucial for the design. How do we tap the 5 senses and create those user experiences, the selection of material, the sense of directionality, identity design, user experience again, if there is any focal point or center of attraction, and of course the profound role of lighting, color, etc. We saw some case studies, again very popular ones, something like Dolce & Gabbana store, and then how the retail store has been designed with all these different elements and principles of interior design put together. So we are continuing our discussions from last week, and then we are seeing the applications here in some of these case studies. We also tried to understand the layout of the floor and of course the color scheme, the motifs, the patterns, the textures, all of that through these case studies. And more pictures to understand the retail spaces and what are the important elements or constituents of creating a very good and successful retail store. More examples and references. Then we tried to understand workspaces, and then we had a discussion on what are the principles of workspace design. And it's very important because many of us belong to the working population, and now after COVID, in any case, work from home is another concept. So in that sense, we have a workspace within our homes also that has become very challenging, demanding, and fascinating aspect of design. So keeping that in mind, and considering we get to spend a lot of time in these spaces, how do we ensure our well-being and comfort? That becomes very important. So here when we talk about principles, for designing workspaces, there is a lot of focus on achieving plenty of storage, and the furniture has to be very, very comfortable so that your health is not compromised. Of course, there has to be sound masking, and the quality of sound has to be kept in check. And there is also a very interesting possibility of utilizing murals and graphics and creating some kind of a interesting environment within workspaces and break the monotony and have some very, very aesthetic and appealing environment also. And then how it is very important to incorporate natural lighting when we especially talk about workspace designs, and how the common areas are treated. So all of these, when you put together, in a nice package, it would result in a good workspace design. Then we saw this case study and we tried to understand, what are the organizing principles and how this is put together. So there was a discussion on our layout and, some interesting elements that have been put over here, like an amphitheater, to create a very interesting environment within this workspace. We discussed the living spaces and then we tried to understand what could be a set of thumb rules or important principles to achieve good living space designs, starting with of course, a good living room layout, then a good color palette, deciding on flooring and walls and good finishes. And then we have to factor in also the storage when we talk about living rooms, just like the workspaces, and lighting, and of course how the windows are dressed up or treated, so openings also. Again, we saw another case study and we tried to understand the application of these principles there. While we were doing this, we were also trying to understand, how we can achieve creativity, sometimes through fusion of old and new, and sometimes trying to use rustic industrial objects or systems as part of our design vocabulary. All those interesting concepts. We talked about restorative spaces, which are very important when we talk about employees, and they ideally, cater to achieving proper mental health, physical health, as well as the emotional well-being of the employees. And these are the key features which are very, very important. So sense of privacy, visual stimulation, and adaptability within the space. These have to be kept in mind. We saw some examples from small scale to large scale, and there were these different elements and how they are put together to achieve these restorative spaces and ensure the well-being at all three levels that we talked about for the employees and the users. Then public spaces, of course, they are very, very important. They are used by, people from different age groups, different genders, and these are also places of sociability, entertainment, transport, leisure, commerce, and they are used very, very comprehensively by diverse audiences and users. So they are very important and they have to be treated with utmost care and caution and important elements and principles of design. Then we talked about transient spaces and what could be the different types of transitions. When we talk about transient spaces, it could be a transition between two destinations, a transition between interiors and exteriors, also a transition between nature and building. So what are these space making elements that provide the transition? And we saw some examples also with case studies, of course. There was a discussion on place versus space and what are these concepts and why they are important for interior architecture. And we had elaborate discussion here. I have just summarized it. So when we talk about space, it basically refers to the physical dimensions and the volume within a structure. And it is the measurable area that encompasses the interior environment. And when we talk about place, that on the other hand goes beyond the physical dimensions. It also delves into emotional and experiential aspects of a space. So we talked about these two concepts, and it's very, very important when we talk about interior architecture projects that we understand also the idea of place, particularization, personalization, all of that. Then we talked about interior design in terms of finishes, materials, and specifications. What are these materials? What are these finishes? What kinds of technical specifications go with them when we look into the market and do the market survey? What are surface treatments? What are installation and application techniques? We saw that. So starting with the finishes, what is the importance of wall finish? How does it protect the space? What kind of finishing goes on the wall, whether it's both side coated or one side coated, and so on. And different materials that could be used as interior wall finishing. So it could be a plaster, it could of course be paint, wood, gypsum panel, artificial stone cladding, metal, glass, all of these materials, it is possible through these materials to achieve interior wall finishing. Then there is floor finishing. Here also we could see all types of finishes. It could be screed, which could be, cement or gypsum based. It could be terrazzo, natural, artificial stone, ceramic, glass, timber, polymers, metals, bamboo, cork, all of these. So we saw the examples of many of these finishes during the entire week. Then moving on to understand ceiling finishes and how it becomes very, very important to, consider finishing while we are, focusing on the ceiling, because sometimes it may have services installed within it. It could be acoustic, HVAC, etc. And then how do we do the finishing in those ceilings? Also, we try to understand that what could be the performance criterion required for interior finishing materials. And it has to be really important, and the benchmarking could be achieved by appropriate visual appearance to begin with. And of course, you have to take care of the functional aspects as well, and the user needs, that is paramount. So there are some tips which are summarized again for selecting materials and finishes, starting with considering the purpose and function of the space, the overall context and the environment, the maintenance requirements for your project, cost considerations, durability, longevity, aesthetics and visual appeal, color, texture, how you're designing the lighting, including the reflectivity, sound and acoustics, of course, the health and safety, and the overall environmental impact. So these are some important aspects. We saw some details regarding surface treatments also, because for interior spaces it becomes very crucial, to have proper surface treatments. Now that is for all purposes, function, aesthetic as well as health. So it's important to understand surfaces, their finishes and treatments. So it's of course essential, like I was saying, to look great and also protect surfaces sometimes, against dampness, etc., or the growth of algae, molds, and all of these. And then we saw some more finishing materials and some installation techniques, which of course I have not discussed here in detail since it's a summary lecture, but we did have a discussion on that, starting with cement. What are cement-based finishing materials? What are cement tiles? Terrazzo flooring, and how that is used in a very interesting manner. Some earth-based materials, we saw ceramic, we saw porcelain, we tried to understand what is terracotta. And when we talk about the earth-based materials, their distinction in terms of being porous, semi-porous or non-porous, and then accordingly how the application is impacted, or where it can be applied based on these properties. So that was the kind of brief discussion we had. Then what are decorative paintings, and they play a very interesting role, for creating a wall treatment or interesting surface finishes. Wallpaper, again, it's very popular, and we can also use timber very gracefully and luxuriously at the same time. Exposed brick and stone is another possibility, to achieve certain kind of rustic finish and some kind of a timeless appeal on the surfaces. There is plaster, which is easy to shape and you can achieve finishes through that. Of course, there is tiling, which is very, very popular. We saw also the laying methods associated with tiling and why they are very crucial to achieve a good finish on the floor. Glass, again, how it is used as a finishing material and how it is installed within interior spaces, some examples of that. Metal is also used these days very popularly. It gives a very interesting finish and appearance. We saw also some examples which highlighted the use of polymers and plastics. Natural stone, of course, very classic and timeless. A lot of clientele prefer that. It's used quite widely. Textiles, we talked about textiles also. And then wood and wood composites. So we talked about composites and byproducts of the timber industry, and why they are important, since we are talking about concerns for environment and reducing the impact on the environment. We had a discussion also on, what are space making crafts, space surface crafts, what is their role in creating and enhancing interior spaces. So, we try to understand building crafts or space making crafts, and these are the crafts which are directly or indirectly related to making of buildings. And what is the relation of craft to society? So, at a philosophical level, we started to understand that, and then how within the making of interior spaces, these play a very important role, and what is the interrelationship. We try to have an understanding on that. And then, what are the different kinds of crafts? When we talk about space making crafts, what are these crafts actually? So, we saw some examples: stone carving, stone inlay, wood carving, stucco, mosaic, and so on. And these actually have both hard material and soft material applications within the designing of spaces. So it could be a hard material like stone, or it could be a soft material like fiber. So we had a broad understanding of that. And also, interestingly speaking, that how the multifaceted field of craft shares its foundation with varied core sectors such as handicrafts, buildings, building construction industry, small scale industries, MSMEs. So, what is the association and what are these important connections? That is also what we focused on. And if we talk about the larger social and environmental context, again, what is the relationship of craft with the larger context, and how it is also a way for humans and the inhabitants of the space to connect to the larger social and environmental context around us. That was also a very, very moving and interesting discussion we had. Then, broadly, just summarizing, when we talked about space making crafts, we touched upon these four broad categories. So, we had the examples of each one of this to understand it better. And we saw some examples, some case studies, and some images to better our understanding, focusing on these concepts. So, another project here from Mysore. Also, again, continuing with the categories of these crafts, we focused also on the space surface craft or the surface narrative craft, and then we saw the broad categories of that. So they were like based on the techniques, there was one classification, and based on the content also, it could be decorative / ornamental or narrative. So we saw these examples, and we tried to understand different kinds of crafts and craft forms and how we see their role in creating and enhancing interior spaces, at what different levels they are incorporated within spaces, at an object level, furniture level, on a surface, like a surface finish, or for storytelling. And of course, like, at a very, very core structural level, how they are integrated or applied or conceived within the structure of the space. So these are some examples that we saw throughout the week, what are the different kinds of crafts from India. So Gond paintings, Madhubani, miniatures, different kinds of paintings, surface finishes, and different kinds of storytelling and narrative craft forms that you see on the screen. Many more examples, different materials, timber, fabric, etc. And again, here this was very interesting. So we saw a comparative chart, showing the SMC and SNC applications along with other crafts at different scales. And we saw a lot of examples from Uttarakhand. We saw classification of crafts. We saw the application at different scales within different spaces in one of the lectures. And here there was a very nice inventorization which summarized, everything for us, focusing on SMC and SNC. So we had matrix in place. So building, the interior architecture element, the interior architecture surface, surface finish and surface ornamentation, furniture, objects and artifacts, hardware and accessories, and then we had this elaborate discussion. And then the traditional crafts thriving all around India, we continued our discussion, and especially since we are trying to understand crafts also through materials, hard materials and soft materials. We saw a plethora of traditional crafts which are seen, all around India, and where there is a profound definition through materiality. So whether it's timber, bamboo, glass, textiles, metals, ceramics, we saw all these different kinds of examples and a huge plethora of these creative crafts that we see, across the length and breadth of the country. We also try to understand the community of makers, the craftspersons, and what are their different roles when we especially talk about interior architecture and space making. So, of course, they are creators and makers, they are also entrepreneurs, and they are also people who have a lot of skill and from whom we can learn, and we see them also as mediators. So there are different roles these makers and community representatives and craftspersons have to offer, and it is actually very interesting to collaborate with them and create an ecosystem and work on projects with them, learning from them, co-learning, and co-sharing ideas. So we have been seeing some examples of such ecosystem. We have seen case studies and projects done by individuals and organizations. So here also I'm just trying to emphasize and showcase that role, and it's very interesting to collaborate with these makers. Then what is the significance of craft and culture in the domain of interior design? And we try to understand that throughout these discussions with the examples, seeing the applications in the case studies. So, of course, starting with the preservation of tradition and heritage, then talking about ethical design, the concepts of sustainability, sustainable livelihoods, and authenticity, cultural connection, all the cultural backdrops and the cultural narratives that these crafts take forward. There is a certain authenticity, in them, and they provide unique indigenous solutions representing India, which can be taken to international platforms. Of course, also they are very significant because there will be a boost to creative economy and informal sectors such as these if we focus them and we try to create a vocabulary through our interior design projects, integrating these kinds of details. Innovation and entrepreneurship, we are all talking about that currently and throughout the last decade, and future also looks like that, focusing on the startups, entrepreneurship, all of that. And then, of course, education and vocation. So when we talk about interior design pedagogy, there is definitely a lot of significance of craft and culture, and I try to integrate them, through the subjects I teach or the studios that I conduct. We had a discussion on space making elements. Space making crafts continued in terms of understanding the skills, tools, techniques, community participation, how do we achieve an ecosystem, establishing the interrelationships amongst all of these, and then how do we apply this interrelationship on our projects, and then we demonstrate this kind of an ecosystem. So, of course, we have seen this chart and starting to understand already the entire universe when we talk about space making elements and the categories. And, broadly speaking, what are the different kinds of elements that we saw through examples? We saw floor. We understood the column through different examples and what are the classical orders of architecture, interior architecture. More examples, this one is wall. We saw the examples of door, gate. We had discussion on all these elements. What are their purposes? What are the semantics behind them? What are their applications? What are the different examples where we see the usage of these? We also saw window, which is an interior element, and we saw its application through one example. Moving on to the stair, we saw different examples of that. roof also. So since it was more like a summary, of course, I've put things in a very overview manner. And throughout the week, we had this discussion on several crucial aspects related to interior design projects. Starting with what are these space making elements that create interior spaces, what are the different classifications in which we can understand them, and what are space making crafts or building crafts, and how can we see their application from an object to a structural level. What are the surface narrative crafts? How do they play a role in storytelling, and how do they create stories about our spaces? And then, what are the different elements, at what levels we see them, at what eye levels we see them, how do they constitute in creating of spaces, different references, different case studies, different examples. All of that was a discussion throughout the week. And I hope you found that very interesting. This book is very, very useful, especially if you are focusing on the fundamentals of interior design and you want to also, proceed with this understanding and you have professional endeavors in mind. This will be a very, very useful resource for all of you. Some more websites. So for the next lecture, we will be focusing on the materials and we will start with wood or timber, which is very crucial for interior design projects. So I'll see you next time. Thank you.